It's Wednesday, June 11th, and this is the morning commute for Mike and Bike. Hello. While we were getting ready this morning to go off to school and to work, I played some videos for the kids on YouTube, or actually one video about a Canadian beer commercial from like 8 years ago or so, about being a Canadian. I think the title was "I Am a Canadian," and there's this man standing on a stage saying all the things he's proud about for being Canadian and what it means to be Canadian. And they have some rousing music in the background and the crowd clapping and cheering. And apparently it was quite a hit at the time. I wasn't in Canada then, living there, but I heard that it was quite popular. And so I thought it was worth showing to my children. And it's cute. But I was thinking about it, and if that's the Canadian identity, you know, that you say about and not a boot, and you support peacekeeping instead of fighting armies or something, which is a couple of the points in the video, then it's a pretty weak identity. So, I don't know. And in fact, some of those points, when you dissect them, a lot of them are just trying to counter American points, or points of what America do, people in the US do, or what the American country does. And that's actually, in some sense, I think, the Canadian identity, which is simply trying to define itself as being other than American. Hello. The great Canadian preoccupation is to prove that they're not Americans, not from the United States anyway. With the great exception, of course, of the Québécois, the people living in Quebec. Well, not all the people in Quebec, but the people of French-Canadian ancestry. Those people do have a unique culture, distinct from American. So the rest of the Canadians that struggle so to define themselves, I would go so far as to say that a huge part of Canadian history can be defined as part of a struggle to be independent from America. You go back to the colonial times with the Revolutionary War in the colonies, the North American British colonies that began the United States. Right back then, you had a lot of the people who were loyal to the king were forced from their homes in the colonies that seceded and formed the United States. And so you had a group of people being sent to Canada who became the core of its population in many respects, who were hostile and had very negative views of America. I mean, heck, they'd been burned out of their homes and chased away under violence. Certainly didn't leave them with a lot of goodwill towards the country of their birth, place of their birth. And so from then on, that led to a lot of angst about being occupied and taken over by the United States. It didn't help with invasions like the War of 1812, where the U.S. sent troops up into the northern British colonies. And then there were a bunch of invasions throughout the 1800s. We had a group of Irishmen, the Fenians, try to invade Canada from the U.S. with tacit support of the government. You had the Huntsmen as well, another group of Americans who thought Canada would be easy pickings. So there were these different waves of invasions or attacks that would come from the United States, not all of them being official U.S. armies, but certainly the U.S. wasn't doing anything to stop these ad hoc militias from forming and trying to seize territory in the British colonies. That certainly exacerbated the feelings of being under threat. And when you look at the founding documents of Canada, the Confederation itself, where the British colonies agreed to form a single union in 1867, if you read a lot of the discussions amongst the delegates who agreed on Confederation, a lot of their rationale was to form a better bulwark against incursions from the United States. And they felt that by unifying, that was perhaps their best way to remain independent and not become American. So you could almost say the very founding of Canada itself was inspired by a desire not to be American. And it goes on from there. The push to build the transcontinental Canadian Railroad was primarily motivated by a desire to ensure that, or to control territory in the West and prevent the U.S. from seizing it. Hello. There's action after action done in Canadian history of national decisions that are done with the primary motivation of simply keeping America out and trying to maintain independence for America. That's all well and good, but it just feels kind of weak to have that as your defining reason, is to be other than American. What makes it even more absurd is that Canada has absorbed so much American culture and will become so much a part of the American milieu anyway, whether it's from the arts to language and literature and everything, that it's even business is so integrated with the United States that these distinctions between Canadianness and Americanness are even more fuzzy than ever. Interestingly, in my own family history, on my mother's side, her father's family goes back to Mormon colonists who were sent from Utah by Brigham Young to colonize various parts of the American West, or West North America. And at the time, the borders were ill-defined, and one group of Mormon settlers were sent to an area of what is today known as southern Alberta and settled there. And that's how some of my mother's ancestors wound up in Canada. So in a very real sense, the people living in Canada were right. At the time, there were Americans moving into territories that were claimed by Canada. So their concerns about losing the West weren't just silly thoughts. No, there was actual migration of Americans occurring at the time. On my father's side, his ancestors were immigrants from the Ukraine, and they moved to Western Canada. This was part of a great era of Canadian immigration where they kind of opened the doors to Europeans who wanted to move into the unpopulated west of Canada at the time. This would be like the early 1900s, late 1800s, I guess in particular. And my ancestors were part of that. But I really don't think they felt all that drawn to Canada rather than the United States. I don't know the details, but I assume that the primary reason they came to Canada was because at the time it might have been a little easier to immigrate, or they had some deal on land they didn't get in the US. Fourth generation Canadian myself, all of those rationales and ethnic identities don't really mean much, which is an interesting point to keep in mind when you consider how people get upset about and concerned about the modern waves of immigrants, whether it's from India or various other nations in Asia or Africa. Given enough time, people do become part of their nations. Heck, even in France, I think they had a president who was of Polish ancestry. I remember reading French history and coming across names of prime ministers and presidents who had Italian last names too. It's interesting that I keep coming to these topics of identity on my commutes. I guess there's a certain fascination there. I'm just thinking about Benjamin Disraeli, one of the great British politicians, prime minister for many years in the 1800s, and he was Jewish. Although I believe that Benjamin converted to the Anglican Church or something, but in my view that doesn't negate his Jewishness. I think we should be proud of our ancestry, but neither do I think we should be bound by it. It was all to the good that Mr. Disraeli decided to become a Christian. If that's something he wanted to do, that was good for him. But it's also still great that he was Jewish as well. That's something I do admire the Jews for in general, is that you can be Jewish, or that your Jewishness is not necessarily tied to your religious beliefs. There are many Jews who are atheists, and yet they are still Jews. I'm a little jealous in a way because Mormons, I wish Mormons were like that. There's a lot of things I really like about my upbringing as a Mormon, and I still feel very culturally in tune to a lot of Mormon mores and attitudes, but I just am not I don't have the same viewpoint on a theological basis anymore. And unfortunately, in the Mormon sphere, if you're not into the religion, you're not a Mormon. Your history, ancestors, and culture notwithstanding, it's really all tied to the religion itself. Well, it may not be the proper definition, but I'm going to say that if a Jew can be an atheist and not bother with keeping a kosher house, then I don't see why somebody can't call themselves a Mormon who doesn't believe in the Mormon theological canon. Of course, that doesn't prevent churches from excommunicating people and shouting from the rooftops that you're not one of us, but these identities are in oneself, independent of what others say anyway. Hello. Go. And this brings us to the end of another episode of Mike and Bike. See you all tomorrow.